everybody, it's Abby from Dabble, and today we're here to talk about fantasy tropes. So, genre tropes are to fantasy readers what football plays are to NFL fans. Now, full disclosure, I don't actually follow football, but I've been around enough fans to know that they will discuss a single play length. And they'll examine why it was genius or predictable or why it did or didn't work in that particular moment and what they would have done if they'd been the one calling it from the sideline. So your readers will have the exact same relationship to fantasy tropes. If you write fantasy and you can't talk about the chosen one, the orphan hero, the mentor, then when someone asks what your book is doing differently, you're going to get caught off guard. So here are the 5 character tropes a fantasy author needs to know cold. What are they? What are they doing for your story? And how do you keep yours from reading as like copy paste? So let's get into it. First, what is a trope in the first place? Like a trope is just a commonly recurring storytelling device that your genre keeps returning to over and over. It can be a character, theme, a setting, a structure, a symbol. Basically, it's just a pattern that shows up across a lot of different stories. So here are some examples that you've definitely seen, like the wise old mentor with the long beard, or the external battle between good and evil, or the ancient prophecy that no one quite knows how to interpret. So it's not the same as a cliche. Tropes are different. They have depth. Cliches are what happens when a trope gets executed the same way too many times. And we'll get into that distinction in part 3 of the series. But why bother knowing about your genre's tropes? Well, we see tropes time and time and time again because they touch something deeper. It's like big universal stuff. It's purpose, it's mortality, it's identity, it's belonging. These are big subjects. And readers actively pick up your book because it has the tropes they love in it. The romance readers do the same thing with fake dating, which is my favorite, and enemies to lovers. Fantasy readers, they want their chosen one, man. So practical reason number 1 to know your tropes is you need the vocabulary. Beta readers, editors, agents, publishers, readers, nay, fans, they all use these terms. And if you can't, then you sound like you don't actually read in your genre. So reason number 2 to know your tropes. When you know what trope you're writing, you can decide what to do with it. You can honor it, twist it, subvert it, modernize it. And you can't make any of those choices if you don't know what you've got to work with in the first place. So, one note here for any low fantasy writers in the audience. These tropes still apply. They're not just for sprawling, epic, high fantasy with dragons. They show up in Coraline. They show up in Stranger Things. They show up in any story where genre conventions are doing some structural work. So, now that you know why you need them, let's look at 5 different fantasy tropes. There are more, but once I start pointing them out, you're going to be able to spot a trope on your own. Easy peasy. So, fantasy trope number 1. The chosen one. So here's the setup for this one. It's a specific character, usually the protagonist, who is destined to carry out something massive. Save the world, end a war, fulfill an ancient prophecy. Sound familiar? So they get identified usually by one of 3 things, either that prophecy, a lineage, or some unique ability that no one else has. But here's the catch with this trope. They don't often know it yet. So discovering and embracing their own identity is half the story. So why it works is it taps into this universal question about purpose. What am I here for? Do I have a destiny? What's this specialness going to cost me? So an example is Harry Potter. He has prophecy plus ability. Frodo gets handed the ring almost by accident. Paul Atreides in Dune is lineage plus prophecy. Percy Jackson is lineage. So the risk with this one, it's the trope that readers are sort of most burned out on. The lazy version reads like a Mad Lib, like insert the orphan boy, insert the ancient prophecy, insert a glowing sword, and then done. So here's the fix. Make sure your chosen one's discovery of their purpose feels specific to them. It's not just destiny says so, but it's more like this character, this past, finally understands what they're here for. So that's where the resonance happens for readers. So if you're into portal fantasy, by the way, here's an angle worth looking at. Like in that subgenre, the chosen one sometimes kind of shows up sideways. The kid who crosses through the portal isn't always chosen until the other side decides that they are. So the specialness is contextual. It's not really innate. And that's a fun place to play. All right, fantasy trope number 2, the orphan hero. Here's the setup. The protagonist has lost their parents, or has parents who are functionally absent, or their parents are dead at the start of the story. So big famous ones are like Harry Potter, Frodo, Aladdin, Lancelot, Coraline, who's sort of functionally orphan coded once she walks through that door. The character profile is this. They are guarded, self-sufficient, inclined towards rebellion. They might have had to look out for themselves from a tender age, so they've shielded their hearts. And this is why it works. It instantly gives the protagonist agency. There's no parental safety net. There's nobody bossing them around. They get to be the engine of the story. And when this guarded, self-sufficient kid finally takes a risk for someone else, well, that's like a golden emotional payoff. So worth knowing, this archetype isn't only for heroes. It's also a great blueprint for disturbingly sympathetic antagonists. So your villain might be an orphan too. Maybe they have the same wound, but have made different choices. So middle grade and low fantasy reality check here. I'm going to speak to this from experience. The orphan trope is everywhere in our space because young protagonists need agency, and adults are the ones that are usually telling kids what to do. So if you have to get the grown-ups off stage somehow, orphaning is the cleanest tool. Boarding school works. Single working parent who's never home works. Just figure out your own version. So fantasy trope number 3, the reluctant hero. All right, here's the setup for this one. They're the person who's supposed to save the day, but would rather not, please and thank you. Like there's 2 flavors of this one. The first one is common person. There's an ordinary kid with an ordinary life who just doesn't see themselves as special. So Bilbo Baggins, Percy Jackson in chapter 1, Frodo, Aang in Avatar. Flavor 2 is the capable but unwilling. So they actually do have the power, they just don't want the job. So Aragorn for most of Lord of the Rings, Eleven during her self-imposed retirement in Stranger Things. Here's why it works. Readers love watching someone resist the call before they answer it. The reluctance creates a real dramatic tension, and it sort of models real life. So most of us don't want our hardest assignments either. Failure is part of the architecture here. Reluctant heroes face many failures before unlocking their inner hero. Now, the most common mistake I see is when writers make the reluctance feel whiny. So the reader has to understand why this specific character doesn't want the role. Bilbo wants his armchair. Percy wants his mom's seat. Aang just wants to be a kid. So each one of these has a specific reason. So just saying I'm scared isn't good enough. Okay, we're nearing the end here. Fantasy trope number 4, the Dark Lord. The setup for this one is it's the protagonist's arch nemesis. They are the embodiment of pure evil, the source of all the suffering in the world. But the thing that makes a Dark Lord scary isn't just the power, it's the followers. So a Dark Lord without minions is just a mean wizard. Like a Dark Lord with minions is a whole movement. So examples, Voldemort, Sauron, Darth Vader. And for Portal Fantasy nerds, the other mother in Coraline, who is, in my opinion, a great underrated Dark Lord. So the structural piece that makes this trope work is limited contact. So the protagonist almost never goes head-to-head with the Dark Lord until the climax of the story. So most of the book or most of the series, you're dealing with the Dark Lord's lieutenants, the Dark Lord's consequences, the Dark Lord's reach. That's how, as a writer, you're building dread. And these days, the cackling evil just to be evil Dark Lord is sort of fading out. Audiences want some sort of backstory now. They're looking for a hint of how the Dark Lord became this way. Outright sympathy is not required, but humanizing them a little is. So, low fantasy and portal fantasy note. Think hard about whether your antagonist actually needs to be a full Dark Lord or whether a smaller, more intimate villain serves the story better. The other mother in Coraline is proof. Scale doesn't have to mean kingdoms. It can mean this villain has total power inside this one weird house. And that's so fantasy trope number 5, the mentor. All right, the mentor is a character who has their own significant powers and who pours them into training the protagonist instead of using them themselves. The mentor has to feel a real fondness for the hero. They also have to have an irritating tendency to explain things in the vaguest terms possible. So, like, Yoda doesn't give straight answers. Dumbledore famously withholds. Gandalf disappears for like whole swaths of the book. The classic version of this is the wise old mentor. So think kind man, robe, beards, cryptic riddles. But the trope has expanded a lot. So Iroh in Avatar, White Hands in The Gilded Ones. Mentors come in all genders, mental states, facial hair preferences. Mentors, though, are vague on purpose. If your mentor explains everything, your protagonist has no growth arc. So the mentor's job is to just gesture towards the answer and then step aside. The hero has to do the rest. So the one thing about mentors you don't always notice consciously, they tend to disappear before the climax. Think about it. Gandalf falls into Moria. Dumbledore dies. Obi-Wan gets cut down. The hero has to face the end without their teacher. That isn't a coincidence, by the way. These days, mentors with ulterior motives are having a real moment. Your mentor might not actually be on your hero's side. Worth playing with that if you haven't. So, last part here, let's wrap this up. Those are the 5 character tropes that you should be at least conversational about. The chosen one, the orphan, the reluctant hero, the Dark Lord, and the mentor. These are the people. So next time in part 2, we're going to cover the world. So the hero's journey, magical artifacts, forbidden magic, vast geography, and prophecy. These are the structural tropes that build the place where the characters live. So subscribe so you don't miss part 2, and I'll see you then.